Well, a rather interesting dream. I was doing some sort of examination. There was something like a couple of hours in which to do it. I wasn't at the centre, presumably some sort of organised, university or something. I had my completely off-the-wall way of passing this exam, but in the end I couldn't get to the centre. And of course great frustration in that I sort of needed to. I mean, silly things like I couldn't find blank paper to write on to take with me. But the whole thing seemed very real, of course, because I'm in a dream. The dream's a reality while it's on. I'm fairly conscious in the dream that I need God's solution. Now then things get a bit hazy. I think I tumble the idea that I could ask for special circumstances in which to sit the exam. But I'm mindful of the fact that I'm in some sense beholden to pass it in the normal way. And I'm feeling that that's just not going to pass the exam if I do that. I'm puzzled and perplexed. And then I find, of course, I've woken up. Well, I'm glad that I'm aware of God in the dream, albeit not fully aware in, deciding, well, I'm going to thank him for this and see what God has. But more in my pre-Christian days where I would be hoping there was a way round it. But of course the waking up is spectacular. You realise the whole thing is negated as a reality. It's just irrelevant. It's just a dream. And the dream's just there in as far as it can be remembered, and as you can see, even that's a bit tacky, very incomplete. It has some sort of lesson, perhaps. And that's the end of the matter. Except that it illustrates how you can be in what is, in the situation, an impossible situation to find a good solution in. And the miraculous can happen. It's simply a dream. Now look, when your life is over, assume for a moment you could review. Well, if you can review it, it really doesn't matter because it's now in the past. And what matters is whatever that new present, as it seems, is. And you will be living that reality, not this one. You'll remember bits of this one. Perhaps there'll be a perfect record and you can remember it all. And presumably it'd be a great benefit to you in going forward in whatever dimension of reality you are then in. If you think about it, that's a bit like looking at your past, isn't it? I can think of the difficulties of my stomach turning over when Dad comes home at night and I'm laying in bed wondering if they'll have another argument downstairs and hoping that they won't, and hearing him come up the stairs. Well, I know there's no fear or danger to my direct welfare. He'll just go to bed. He always does. I almost know he's not a danger to me. He's only a danger with Mum, as I see it, of course. Probably not the reality. He's just struggling under whatever difficulties he and Mama have between them. And that's something I'm not fully able to grasp as a whatever, 10, 11, 12-year-old, whatever, 13 even. But now, N years on, it's scarcely worth me even remembering, and I'm putting it in a quite different context now of, if you like, my maturity of it wasn't that dangerous, and it's a shame it couldn't have been otherwise, and yes, it's not a good situation for a kiddie to be in, but there were checks and balances. I mean, Mum was very loving and protecting of me, and as I felt, and well, you look at it now extremely objectively, it's not a great trouble or worry to you. And I suppose the lesson of the experience just now is, on waking, that it is a dream. Ah, well, that's a wonderful solution, by God. I didn't think of that way out. One was bogged down in the situation, in my case, of trying to, enter this exam and pass it. But in hindsight, it wasn't a reality even. It doesn't need a solution. Can you look at life like that? It doesn't need a solution. Even if we look on the mega scale of, as we understand it, the world, the present day world, in this case in the 21st century, and say to yourself, it's been like this for thousands of years. In many ways it's not worse than, say, the devastations of the 20th century and so on. It's passing. It's always been like this. It may continue like this. It's not relevant. It's something to be observed. Or at least it could be. Since this does not, or while this does not wake me from the dream, I'll continue handling it in whatever seems a rational and best way. But I'm not going to, in some sense, I'm not going to despair about it. For instance, I'm reading Gladys Aylward's story, her life of being a missionary in China during the time of the Japanese invasion and the communist struggle with the previous regime, the whatever it was called. Well, terrible things happen, as they do in wars. And a particular incident that I was reading, and I just found I was reading it to my little girl, and I realised, well, this is a bit frightening. Unfortunately, it's incredibly glossed over by the writer. Is simply stated and left at that. Nothing graphic. It is written for younger people to read. It's not written for adults. It's not written to entertain or to thrill or to, whatever. I was thinking of the incident that the chap who, in the account, was being asked to use his mules, donkey type things, mule animals, to carry the armaments for the enemy. And he refused to do it. And as a consequence, they killed his family. and not him. And of course I realised they didn't kill him because they needed him to manage the mules to carry the armaments and ammunition through the hills of China. And he probably knew the only way of getting them across the country much better than they did. So from their point of view, they had to have his cooperation because they're in a war situation, and no doubt the, if you like to call him that, the commanding officer of the enemy that were there, would be shot himself if he doesn't do all he can in the war effort. So he's got to get this guy to manage the mule train and carry his armaments, even though he's the enemy. What's the rational solution to this, as opposed to the mayhem of him having his family killed as a punishment? Well, the punishment does the enemy no good, does it? They still want him to run the mule train. And if he's lost everything, all his family, he might just kill himself and not run the mule train. You see, what seems to be the vicious punishment for not helping is avoidable. Even in a rational sense, they should have said, look, we've got to do this. We're in a war. We know we're the enemies of each other, but we're both trapped in this situation. Now, I have to force you to do what we want. And I will, because otherwise I get killed myself, quite probably is the situation. You can certainly believe that. And you as the muleteer should realise that, ideally, that, well, I don't want to do this, and God understands. I mean, let's start to introduce God into the picture. That's the only answer to some difficulties. God will understand, so I shall do what they ask. I shall run the mule train, and at some point in the future, I may be able to still do good and minimise what, the outcome of the harm outcome here. No loving God holds you responsible for unreasonable duress in your decision-making. The responsibility is with those that put the duress on you, which in this case is the war situation. You can, like in Second World War approach, ultimately punish the person at the top, who seems to have the power, at least, and probably does have, in the case of, say, Hitler, or in the case of the Japanese, presumably the emperor has the power to change what the regime's doing. But I might point out he might not have. He may be in a situation where he himself is more like a puppet and in the hands of forces beyond his control. And he knows it. And we don't. Well, that's another possibility, isn't it? But do you see, the concept of blame is completely screwed up in our history. It's very convenient for us to say, you are responsible for this decision, as opposed to saying, you are in a situation in which rationally you should do the following thing. And the situation is terrible. But rationally, nonetheless, you should do so and so. And the rational solution very often is far better than the solution we go for. Now, you could say in this particular case the invading army was wrong in not discussing with the volunteer and pointing out to him. And then it would have been wrong if the volunteer hadn't have, in some sense, been able to understand this. And then the outcome would not have been as it was, which was horrendous, and, well, obviously the man's life was utterly wrecked. The muleteer's life was utterly wrecked by the outcome of the decisions in the situation. Both sides could have been rational, even though they're in very difficult situations. Does it matter now? What is it, 100 years later or whatever it is? I don't know. Actually, I think it's more like, yeah, well, it's a lot of years, 80 years later or something, is it? Well, it's just another frightening saga of war, isn't it? One of millions of, or possibly even trillions of awful things that have happened in the past. And they're very instructive to us in that it makes us long for good and try and reason out how good can be achieved and bad things can be avoided in the future. And that's built into our very psyche, isn't it? How could this be better? How can we improve life? And that seems to be the purpose of this life we have in this universe. Now, if it's just an ongoing saga, a never-ending trail of these mistakes, it seems hardly of worth in itself. It's only of worth if we surmise some external reality that we're being trained for. I mean, I put it in, if you like, rather childish terms, but that we're being trained for the eternal kingdom of heaven. And we need to be perfectly orientated in order to not spoil such a place. You know, it is to be safe. And we are trained to enter the kingdom of heaven so that when we graduate from here, we are of a disposition in terms of values and inclination and intentions that if we are given the infinite abilities of being in heaven, we will be utterly safe in our use of them. There'll be no misuse. Now that's a way of understanding, you know, looking in reverse, our present situation. And it seems that it can make our present situation considerably better. Our present situation continues, of course, whilst we are still here, to demonstrate with the problems that come up what's good and what's evil and what's the consequence of such and what we therefore value and what we therefore reject. That's ongoing. You know, the classroom is a place in which lessons are always held. And if lessons stop being held, well, you may as well pull the school down, mightn't you, because you're not using it anymore. Well, it is still here and is still being used and it is still giving us the lessons. So, presumably, it is still achieving something from some external understanding which we as children do not master and have. Let me review in a moment. Let me pause. Oh yes, just in reviewing this, it occurs to me I should give you a better solution in the Gladys Aylward particular incident of the mule tear. If the invading Japanese had been rational, they would have realized that it would have been better to say, look, we will kill one by one each of your family until you agree, so that he always had some family still to lose, and therefore comply. After all they need is compliance. They don't need to hurt him or his family. They just need his compliance. You may say, well, you know, I mean, if he's of no use to them, they probably won't even bother to kill him because they've got better things to do. They're fighting a war. If they think they need to kill him, that's the safest thing. Well, of course they will, and that'll be the end of it. So the rational solution should have been, we're going to do this one by one. You know the reality of it. You've seen our brutality in other ways, and therefore you succumb and you say, right, I'll carry your armaments for you and I'll take them through the hills. And then, of course, if you're really wise, well, you could choose now to die, it's true, but take the almonds into the lake, I mean, or if that's not possible, misguide them so they get lost in the hills and then you kill yourself. You don't know then whether they will take revenge on your family. There's no point because you're dead anyway and they've got better things to do. Do you see? There are better outcomes than the outcome that is in the account in the book that actually took place. We understand from the author. So I'm not saying that in some sense to recognize this reality might just be a dream is a way of doing nothing and just passively watching it. You can still do what seems rationally best in the situation and make the situation somewhat better. That's not the same as God's intervention in simply waking you up or suddenly putting it, as is now, in the past by at least 80 years. And somehow it all becomes simply an instructive lesson. Because the people are, in terms of this experience here in this universe, no longer even alive, and you never knew them anyway. It becomes more like a dream with time. Time itself heals in that way. And that in itself is very instructive, isn't it? Even if you don't grasp the thread of what I've just recorded here, that time itself heals. In the Buddhist understanding, you see, everything passes, which seems undeniably true in the terms of this universe. And indeed it is that troubles us and drives us to want to put meaning to life. Now in Buddhism, I think they do put a meaning to life in some sense. Again, they claim that, this is a progression or development towards something eternal, an eternal enlightenment or state of being, a transcendence of it all. And in that sense, it's a religion. It surmises solutions that wouldn't otherwise be at all convincing. And you may say, yes, and hence points out the fraudulence of religion. But the reply is no. It's found to be better to do so. That not only does it help you to cope with what is in the more recent past much better, your heart is calmed, your fears are to some extent eased, but it leads to better decisions in the present. And the question is, does the religion that you have lead to better conditions, or did it end up you choosing to be crucified and your family? Then it's not so clear. A good religion says, not with Paul, but with some Christian theologies, which is, no, he's the perfect sacrifice. That's the end of the matter. No more sacrifice is necessary. Now we do seem to have improved on circumstances in as far as this religion is followed, because we're saying there's no need to feel guilty. It's all been done. Now, of course, I claim, hang on, there wasn't any need to feel guilty in the first place. The Buddhist approach in some sense is valid, that we're all a consequence of causes and conditions. I don't own to having made this decision. The I is very much at the mercy of all sorts of situations way beyond my control. And I just do what's rational in the circumstances. And if I do what is rational in the circumstances, I may well manage to minimize, because this is my goal, the harm that is done. So the Buddhist says, well, if someone's harmful to you, and the Christian says this too, don't hit back. And the world says, well, perhaps you need to. And there's some dilemma there. And the dilemma is solved by your inclination as to whether to follow the religious solution or the world solution, and that will depend on what sort of person you are to date, which is not something that I argue is within your control. It's a consequence of, at the very least, from birth upwards, circumstances that you've experienced and that have fashioned your values and decision-making, or lack of it, accordingly. What you will find is, if you really analyze it closely, is that we can only be rational about our situation of uncertainty. But we can be rational. And it's rational to choose a path which seems to be better in the context of what we take to be reasonably true and valid. We can do no other. It would be madness to do otherwise. So if I find that trusting in God makes my life much better and the decisions I make seem to have less harm as a consequence, then that's a good thing to do. It's better than not. If I find that trusting in God seems to result in, everyone on earth being destroyed in a flood other than 8 people, well, I'm just a bit suspicious that that wasn't the best outcome. Do I gain anything by trusting in God in this situation? Or do I end up with a God that causes me to act in ways that seem to result now in a judgment coming and, I don't know, 1/3 of the earth's people being destroyed by, the plagues of Revelation, Book of Revelation? If that turns out to be the reality, perhaps the religion wasn't such a good idea. After all, it's still unknown from the perspective of this universe. I'd have done better to have believed a better religion, or if I could find one. What's a better religion? A better religion is that God doesn't believe in blame. Doesn't believe that you're to blame. He's master of the show. On the contrary, everything is unfolding as he expects. But it is a dream. It's a school. It's actually a controlled lesson. And when you wake up from it, you're none the worse for it, but on the contrary, you're the better. For you now know the reality of good and evil and its consequences. And you are changed as a person accordingly to one that seeks good and refuses to seek evil. You are ready for paradise. Ah, now that would be good. I wonder if that is the case. Do I gain anything by believing to the contrary? Well, by comparison, the answer is no. I mean, it's better to believe in this wonderful God and wonderful heaven, and that this is the meaning to what would otherwise appear an abominable reality of living in this universe at times. Not all the time. Much of the time we're oblivious to the bad and just involved in the good. And at other times we're fully involved in the bad and oblivious to the good. Well, although it's got everyday language in it, this recording is analysing in some depth the situation, the dilemma that we seem to face, and what the solution might be. And to drop the complexity in that analysis for a moment, we're simply saying that if you behave as if and imagine God to be both existent and your dad, all-powerful and loves you, then your life here is considerably better. If you don't believe me, taste and see, try it. If it's not, you don't have to follow it, do you? If it is, you'll know the way to go. How do I do this in practice? Well, thank God for everything, as if I were in trust, trusting Him that this is just a show, and that in some sense He's in charge and to my good, because He's my dad. If I live like that, thanking God for at least everything that I see to be good, is my life transformed for the better? If the answer's yes, well, you'll know which way to go in the future, won't you? You'll continue to do it. And if the answer's no, what have you lost by doing it? By continuing to thank Him for the good. So I'll keep on practicing, because I've nothing to gain by not. Because when I focus on all that's wrong and keep trying to battle with it and putting it right, I just find the story goes on and on and on. And I despair and die. I would rather not despair and have this faith. And if death still overtakes me, well, that's all right. That'll either be the end of the story, or I'll be found to be absolutely right. And the story needn't be repeated, because I'm in paradise, part of the kingdom of heaven. Now, that's the sort of grand picture. But the practical thing that attends our consciousness and reality from day to day is that life does seem to be much better by trusting in a loving God. And the decisions you make are considerably more loving and kind. You find there's peace in your heart, that there's joy and they are filled with hope, and that in this blessed state you make very kind and loving reactions to people around you and are a great blessing as opposed to a curse. We have every good reason to continue in our solution to trust in God as your dad in the Jesus story. There's a reason for that story surviving 2,000 years. And that's so with most religions. And the reason is that they tend to help mankind rather than be a problem. They are a problem still in that they're not perfect and complete, but they seem to be a great step in the right direction. And in fact, It's not clear that we can manage civilization without this sort of thing that we call religion. We are dispensing with it increasingly as we plough through the 21st century. Or are we looking for something that's simply an upgrade to our religion? I don't think that political correctness can quite fill that void. But the jury is still out on that. What do you think? Bless you. Thank you, Dad.